Erev Tov to everyone. Firstly, Yasher Koach for Jesse for arranging this very special day. And I think all of the Limud Torah that takes place today is in his credit and the others who work on it, so Yasher Koach to them. It's a great pleasure to be here. And like any good relay race who was in the last slot, he knows that whatever happened up till the last slot, we have to finish on time for Mincha. And so, Emir Hashem, we will, and I'll do my best to present this very important topic in the time that we have. Everybody's familiar with the mitzvah Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Just for us to see the basis in the Torah, we all know Vayikra Perek Yutet, Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha, the prohibition not to hate our brethren, the dinim that connect to it, Hochiach Tochiach, Nikama, Netira, and the culmination of the two psukim, not only the isur of sin'ah, but the mandate of Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Not just not to hate, but the expectation that we love each other as we love ourselves. Most interesting part of the pasuk is its conclusion that doesn't get much press. Ani Hashem. And you wonder what the connection is between loving each other and God as God. They seem to have nothing to do with each other. Why is Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha Ani Hashem? We'll get back to that. But let's move forward and see the weight that Chazal saw this pasuk as having. We're all familiar with the statement of Rabbi Akiva. There's a discussion going on in the Midrash. What is the klal gadol in the Torah? Ben Azai says it's Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam, which is surprising because it seems to be a nondescript pasuk. Why is that so important? Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. But Rabbi Akiva says Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. What a strong statement about its grand importance. But really the importance of this pasuk was highlighted already a few generations before Rabbi Akiva. My wife spoke about Rabbi Akiva. We'll go a few generations back to Hillel. Hillel encourages us to be of the Talmidim of Aaron. The Talmidim of Aaron pursue two things, peace and kiruv. They try and bring people closer. But these pursuits are driven by loves. They pursue peace because they love peace. They're rodef shalom because they're ohev shalom. And they're involved in kiruv umikarvan l'Torah, not because of some ideological drive, but because they love people. Ohev et abriot umikarvan laTorah. Hillel's mission is driven by this ahava. And as we know from the story in the Gemara in Shabbat, it's not just something that he was na'ah doresh. Hillel lived this, the very famous story of the ger who came before Shammai and asked to be converted while standing on one foot. Shammai saw this as chutzpah. But when the ger came in front of Hillel, Hillel responded the very famous line, Di alach sani lachavrecha lo ta'avid. What you don't want done to you, don't do unto others. Zohi kol haTorah kula. It's more than a klal gadol. It's the whole Torah in its entirety. How could Hillel say this? So of course the Midrash teaches us that Hillel derived it from the pasuk. Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Mikan amar Hillel. What you don't like done to you, don't do to others. But how could he say it's the whole Torah? Rashi struggles with this. Rashi's first pshat is just like we should respect Re'acha, our own friends, we should respect God who's also our friend. Re'acha ze HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, it seems a little contrived. Rashi then says the next pshat, Chaverecha mamash, kegon gzela, gneva, niuf, virova mitzvot. Most of the mitzvot involve how we interact with each other. Really? I thought most of the mitzvot are how we interact with God. Rashi is struggling to find an explanation that can explain how the Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha can be the whole Torah. It really is surprising. In Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll see how this is so. But let's continue beyond stating that it's a central mitzvah. Let's see the impact that not fulfilling this mitzvah has, and that's the 3-week period we're beginning today, but much more as we're about to see. Mara and Yoma asks why the first Beit Mikdash was destroyed, and it mentions the 3 cardinal sins, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim. And then it asks, what about the second Beit Mikdash? The people were oskim b'Torah, uva mitzvot, ugmilut chasadim, they were wonderful people, why was it destroyed? The Gemara answers, Mipnei shahayta bo sinat chinam, because there was baseless hatred. And let's stop for a second and see something from here. It's possible for people to be involved in Torah, mitzvot, and gemilut chasadim. They could be doing a lot of good, but still hate each other. And that brings churban. The Gemara continues and tells us, L'lamedcha, and I think this could be translated as, the Churban teaches you. Maybe it happened to teach us. Sheshkula sinat chinam keneged shalosh averot. That sinat chinam has the same weight as all these other sins together. In fact, Rabbi Yochanan on the next line tells us that the fingernail of the first generation was greater than the full stomach of the later generation. And the Gemara explains that the meaning of this was, think about the two Churbanot. The first one lasted 70 years. That's how long it took to repair those three cardinal sins. And the second Churban. So what does it tell you about the weight of Sinat Chinam? And we know that that's where the first galut of the Jewish people began. Bereshit Perek Lamed Zayin. It began with brothers who hated their own brother. This is the antithesis of Yerushalayim. Because in the Mizmor Tehillim that focuses most on Yerushalayim, bottom of page 1, moving to page 2, Shira Ma'alot David Samachti Be'omrim Li Bet Hashem Nelech, where David recounts the simcha of going to the Bet Hashem, how Omedot Hayu Agleinu B'Sharayach Yerushalayim, the feet standing in the gates. What is Yerushalayim for David HaMelech? Yerushalayim Habinuya Ke'ir Shechubra La Yachdav. Yerushalayim is the city that brings Jews together. As we mentioned in Shoftim Perek Chaf, Ke'ish echad chaverim. And this had halachic significance because we know that in the times when they had ta'ara, we had to be careful that things should be pure. The food they ate would be pure. If someone who wasn't careful for the laws of ritual purity touched the food, they assumed that it wasn't pure anymore. But the Mishnah in Chagigah tells us that during the time of Regel, when the Jews would come up together to Yerushalayim, they put a moratorium on these laws. And they assumed that whoever touched it was tahor and it was okay. Why? The Gemara explains in the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, Ir Shemechaberet Yerushalayim Zelazeh. Yerushalayim is a city that's meant to connect Jews to each other. That's how the Malbim explains. The next part of the Mizmor, moving back to the top of the page, the Mizmor continues and says, Shalu Shlom Yerushalayim Yishlayu Avayich. Why does the Mizmor speak about us reaching out and asking how each other is? L'man achai v're'ai adaber nashalam bach, the famous psukim. Because if Yerushalayim is meant to bring us together, the way to rebuild it is by caring for each other. And we know. We know from the details of the Churban. We can see on a practical level how the Sinat Chinam brought the downfall of the Jewish people. We all know in the second part of the page the famous story of Kamtza Uvar Kamtza. What a person's willing to do not to have somebody at their meal. Later in Josephus' report, second source from the bottom of the page, he tells us that when the Romans came to the walls of Jerusalem, the Jews were too busy expending their energy, time, resources, armaments on fighting each other. They had no koch for the Romans. And if we look to conclude this point on the bottom of the page, the Rambam writes something very scary to us, very incisive. The Rambam writes, Al Tomar she'ein tshuva ela me'averot sheyesh be'em ma'aseh. Don't think that tshuva only applies to things that involve a deed, like znut or gezel or gneva. Ela keshem shetzarich adam nashuv me'elu. Just like a person needs to fix their deeds, kachu tzarich lechapes b'deot ra'ot sheyesh lo. A person has to fix their characteristics, their personality. V'lashuv min ha'kas, u'min ha'eva, u'min ha'kina, u'min ha'hitul, u'mirudifat ha'mamon v'ha'kavod, u'mirudifat ha'ma'achalot. Hakol tzarich lachzor b'tshuva. The Rambam makes a very important point. Tshuva is about who we are, not just what we've done. Fixing oneself doesn't just mean changing what we do. It means focusing on refining our character, which impacts what we do. The Rambam writes in a chilling fashion, last line, Ve'elu ha'avonot, these sins, the Rambam calls them sins, kashim me'otam sheyesh be'em ma'aseh, they're worse than things that have deeds. Shebizman she'adam nishka ba'elu kashehu lefrosh mehem. When a person gets caught in a cycle of character, it's very hard to separate from it. And it's not only the Churban HaMikdash and this period of Avelut that connects to this idea. On an individual level also our relationships break down when we can't have the requisite love we're supposed to. The top of page 3, the Mishnah in the second parak of Avot tells us, Rabbi Yoshua says, the Ayin Hara of Bilam, the Yetzer Hara, and Sinat Abriot, the hatred people have for each other. Motziin et ha'adam min ha'olam. It can take a person out of his regular world of existence. It can keep a person from being happy in their normal world. Forget destroying the whole Jewish people. We can't be happy ourselves. And many have the custom to mourn during periods of Sefirat HaOmer. Where does that come from? The second source on page 3. Rabbi Akiva, the same Rabbi Akiva, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah, had the 12,000 pairs of Talmidim. They are presented as pairs. Great scholars, not people who need to do tshuva, great scholars. And what does it say about them? They all died in this period, mipnei shelo nahagu kavod zeh b'zeh. Even great people have a problem, not just respecting, but showing respect for each other. Sometimes we feel that when we show respect for each other, we're giving ground. We have this natural competitiveness. We can't show respect to each other. And that's when we lose even a relationship with a chavruta. And the Gemara continues, V'haya ha'olam shamem. The world became desolate when these relationships fell apart. Tell Rabbi Akiva taught 5 more Talmidim after the 24,000 who perished. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. And the last of these Talmidim, the lesser well-known Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, became the one who carried this message of respecting our peers. The Mishnah in the 4th parak of Ahavat, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua tells us, we should respect our students. Yichvod talmidcha chaviv alecha kishalach. Uchvod chavercha kemora rabach. The kavod for our friends should be like the kavod we showed to the Rabbi Akiva. In fact, when this Rebbe Eliezer was on his deathbed, his Talmidim came to visit him and they said, Rebbe, teach us, Rabbeinu, how to live our lives properly in this world and merit the next world. What would you think he would start with? Amar lahem, hizaru b'chvod chaverechem. This is where it begins, the way you treat each other. So the times the Jewish people mourn, we mourn for things that were caused because of the breakdown of our relationships. And that's why Rav Kook has a very powerful statement. The 5th source from page 3, he says, Im nechravnu v'nechrav ha'olam imanu al yedei sinat chinam. If we were destroyed, and the world was destroyed with us through baseless hatred, and how do we know the world was destroyed with us? Because what did it say in the 2nd source on page 3? When the Talmidim died, b'pnei shelo nahagu kavod zeh lazeh, V'haya ha'olam shamem. The world became desolate. What do we do to fix it? We're beginning a period of the 3 weeks. Later for Sfaradim, the 9 days, Shvuah Shechalbo. What should we do? People focus on avilut, on what we don't do, on being sad. We need to focus on what we need to do to fix it. Says Rav Kook, we need to go back to the roots. Nashuv lihibanot will once again be rebuilt. We within ourselves, v'ha'olam imanu yibaneh. Al yedei ahavat chinam. And Rav Kook makes a very strong statement about ahavat chinam, a source that everyone always finds trouble with. We won't have enough time to talk about it fully, but I'm going to read it to you so everybody will walk out with a question and upset. Is everyone ready? Rav Kook writes, next source, Midat ha'ava shruya b'nishmat tzadikim. The midah of love that resides in the soul of tzadikim, kolelet et kol habruim kulam. It includes all creations. That's not the shocking part. Without the exception of any object or people. We have to love even Amalek. As we kill them, we have to love them. What does it mean? And I think we begin to get to the answer in the next section here. Rav Kook talks about briot, bruim, because that's what Hillel spoke about. What did Hillel say? Be a Talmid of Aaron. Ohev shalom. V'rodef shalom. Ohev et habriot. Why does Hillel use the word briot? He should have said Ohev Yisrael, Ohev Anashim. What is briot? So the first Lubavitcher Rebbe in his Sefer Atanya, the Lubavitcher Hasidim consider it to be not coincidental that it's in the 32nd Perek Lev. In Perek Lev, he speaks about this Mishnah and he says the reason Hillel uses the word briot is to teach us that we need to love even people who have nothing going for them but the fact that they were created by God. That is enough of a reason to love someone, to love something. And he continues in the 2nd paragraph, even those who there's a lot to hate about, who we're supposed to hate the deeds they do, we need to love whatever there is to love. And I think the source for this is, listen carefully, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Why? Ani Hashem. I created. You don't like it? In fact, the Gemara tells a story on the bottom of the page 3, Ta'anit Afchaf, a shocking story about one of the rabbis who was riding on a donkey. Maybe this explains what happened next. And a person came over to him, an ugly person, and said to him, Rabbi, shalom! And the rabbi ignored him. And again the person said, Rabbi, shalom! And the rabbi said, don't say hello to me, you're ugly! What was going on here? Thought maybe he was riding on a donkey. It was very painful. I don't know. Maybe some people suggest it was a person who was a heretic, whatever. In any case, the person responded, Rabbi, tell it to the one who made me. The rabbi realized his mistake. He got off the donkey and begged for forgiveness. The man refused to forgive him. The whole story continues. If we continue ourselves on page 4, this is why the Mishnah in the 6th parak of Ahavat, that's customary to read before Shavuot, when it talks about how a person develops when they're osek b'Torah lishma, Rabbi Meir Omer, kala osek b'Torah lishma, what should happen to a person? He should become a re'ah, a friend, and a huv, someone who's beloved. Ohev et hamakom, ohev et habriot. Love of God should lead to love of His creations. And later in the 6th Mishnah, when it talks about the 48 things a person needs to grow in Torah, again, ohev et hamakom, ohev et habriot. It's not coincidental. The way you grow in Torah is by internalizing a love of God that expresses itself in loving His creations. And the more you grow in Torah, the more that should become true about yourself. Rav Kook summarizes this idea. Second source on page 4, he says, Mi shechoshev binyanei ha'elokut b'ta'aratam. A person who thinks in a godly, pure way, meaning it's possible to be in a godly, impure way when your ego gets involved, I believe is the explanation. But when you put your ego out, he can't hate or denigrate anything in the world because they're all creations of God. Where does sin'ah and denigration come from? It comes from our choice to focus on what something is lacking instead of focusing on what something has going for it. Loving God should generate loving His creations. And let's flip it over in the thought of Maimonides, the Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, who says so beautifully to us, not only should love of God generate love of His creations, but the way to get to love of God is through His creations. We all know the Rambam in Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah when he puts down the cornerstones of Jewish faith. The first thing, Perek Aleph Yesod Yesodot ve'Amud HaChachmot Leida sheyesh hamatzui rishon. The alphabet of Judaism is to believe in God who generates the world. The Chidush of Judaism is Perek Bet. Ha'el hanichbad v'hanora hazeh mitzvah la'ahavo v'liyirah oto. To believe in God, you look at the world, how could there not be a God? But how can you love and fear God? None of us ever met Him. How can you love and fear something you know nothing about? The Rambam continues in Halacha Bet and he says, "Ve'he'achi haderech la'avato v'yirato." And how do you get there? To ahava and yirah, to an emotional bond. B'sha'ah she'yitbonen ha'adam b'ma'asav u'v'ruav ha'niflaim ha'gdolim, etc. When a person studies God's handiwork, how can you not love and fear God? And what in our world is the greatest proof of the greatness of God's ability to create? What's greater than human beings who He creates in His own image? For me, the three greatest proofs of God's existence are Jewish history, that's a shir in and of itself. Jewish history, an amazing, amazing thing. Torah, when you learn Torah correctly, you see. And human beings. That there could be creatures who function this way, we take it for granted. That there could be 7 billion people who all believe they have a purpose in their lives. That people could be infused with Tselem Elokim. The way we get to love God and a relationship with God is through His creations. And this is why the Arizal is quoted in many places as having said that if you want to get up to daven, the first thing you need to do when you come to shul is to be makabel on yourself the mitzvah of the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. What's the connection? Rav Chaim Vital, his student, tells us the only way for our tefillot to get to God is when we appreciate His creations that we know. And this explains a number of shocking sources. The Mishnah in Avot, we all know, asks, who is the respectable one? Ezeu michubad. And it answers, HaMechaber et habriot. It's someone who's comfortable enough with himself that he can show respect to others. But what's interesting here is the proof text. Shene'emar ki mechabdai achaved uvozai yekalu. Those who know the beginning of Shemuel, Sefer Shemuel, this prophecy is Shemuel relating the words of God. Ki mechabdai achaved, Hashem says, those who respect me, I respect them. How can this pasuk be used to describe someone who respects briot? Because the way we respect God is by respecting His briot. When we respect briot, Hashem describes us as mechabdai, and those are the people Hashem is mechabed. Whereas the Mechilta, the Midrash Halacha, and Sefer Shmo tells us, if we have to be careful how we walk up on the Mizbach, not to reveal our erva on the stones, how much more so do we have to be careful in how we relate to people created in the image of God? And I believe that this is the significance of the pasuk we saw Ben Azai quoting in the beginning in the Midrash. What is the klal gadol b'Torah? Rabbi Akiva said, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Ben Azai said, Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. And we asked, what is that pasuk? Why is that so important? Let's read the full pasuk, second source on the bottom of page 4. Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. Biyom biro Elokim Adam. On the day when God created man. Bidmut Elokim asaoto. He made him in the image of God. What could be a greater, more important pasuk than that? Telling us who we are, who each other is. And you see this in the continuation of the Midrash. People only know the first two lines. Let's look at the end of it on the bottom of page 4 where it asks, Shelo tomar ho'il v'nitbazeti yitbazeh chaviri imi. A person will say, what you don't want done to you, don't do to others. What if I have low self-esteem? What if I'm a jokester? I make fun of myself. I make fun of everybody else. I do unto others what I want for myself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Says the Midrash, last line, Im asita ke'enda lem'i ata mevazeh. Just know who you're making fun of. You're making fun of man created in the image of God. And I think this is the explanation on the top of page 5 for the famous Sifra which reverses the order. In the Midrash, Ben Azai goes first and then Rabbi Akiva. In the Sifra, Rabbi Akiva is first. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Rabbi Akiva omer zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Ben Azai omer zeh Sefer Toldot Adam zeh klal gadol mizeh. This is a greater klal. Why? Because it includes all people in all circumstances. And beautifully, to conclude the first part of the shiur, people may be familiar with the Sefer Shalah, Shin Lamed Hey, which stands for Shnei Luchot HaBrit. And he named his Sefer this because he wanted us to appreciate the relationship between the two sides. The side that relates us to God and the side that relates us onto others. And he writes, just as we say, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, we say, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. These two loves are meant to be linked. We say, Habocher bi'amo Yisrael bi'ava ve'ohev amo Yisrael. And only then do we say, Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. So if love of other Jews, if love of God's creation is so important, how can we accomplish it? It must be possible. How? It's easy to sit here in an air-conditioned room and talk about loving Jews. It's a lot harder to love Jews. Does anyone here know any Jews? And if you think it's not hard to love Jews, remember your last flight on El Al. Anyone remembers? Now when you fly with Jews on Delta, it's not so bad, or United, because they're not in the Heim, but whatever we call that, right? When Jews get into their own element is when the bad news begins. Have you ever flown other airlines? Delta, American, they board by group? When they call up group 1, who comes up? The people who have group 1 on the ticket and the Jews. El Al is the only airline in the world that doesn't board by group. Why? Let's imagine El Al attempting to board by group. What? I didn't pay full fare. Now you might ask, why do they have such a rush? They're not going to get a seat. Not going to get a good seat, right? It says on your ticket the seat. The answer, of course, is the overhead compartment, because Jews bring 4 carry-on bags. It's embarrassing. It's free. It's free. We got to bring a whole bunch. It's hard to love Jews. So what I want to talk about in the time remaining is, how is it possible? What can we do? So I want to speak about 2 ideas. One is a very brief idea, which doesn't get us as far as we need to go, and the second is a bigger idea. The first idea is how to build friendship. The second idea is how to develop love. Benjamin Franklin was in the Pennsylvania legislature, and there was a guy there who didn't like him. No matter what he did for him, he didn't like him. One day, Franklin needed to borrow a manuscript from him. And the guy lent it to him, and he noticed that from when he lent him the manuscript, he started to be more of his friend. So Benjamin Franklin noticed something that he formulated. It became known as the Franklin effect. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he who you yourself have obliged. When we help people, we care about them more. God programs us to enjoy helping other people. When we allow ourselves to, when we get past the mental blocks of having grown up in Brooklyn, I grew up in Brooklyn, so I'm speaking from personal experience. We don't give anyone any space, right? But unless it's triple parked, right? But when you get past the mental block of feeling that you're what they call in Israel a friar, right? A loser, if you help someone else. When you allow yourself to, you see that you start warming towards them. And there's a Gemara that said this 1,500 years before Franklin, just not as clearly. The Gemara says, if one person is unloading their donkey and the other is loading, two mitzvot in the Torah to help load or unload, which one should you help first in general? The one who is unloading. Why? Because you feel bad for the animal. Tsar ba'alei chayim. So assumably it wouldn't apply to a car. If they ask Rabbi Sav, if it's a car, assumably it would be equal, right? Because the car has no tsar. Okay. The Gemara says there's one exception. If the person loading is your enemy, help him first. Ohev lifrok v'sonei lit'on. Mitzvah to help the one you hate first. Why? Kedei l'chuf et yitzro. To change the feelings you have. When we do for others, we start to warm to others. Many of the Baalei Musar tell us that the word Ahavat comes from the word Hav, which means to give. Others say you can see the word Ahavat as a shorter version of Atahav. Be someone who gives. And the more we give and the more we do, the more we feel for the people we're giving to and helping. That's friendship. But what about Ahavat? Ahavat is a much bigger task. And I believe the secret to Ahavat runs through understanding, and I'll explain what I mean, and it's something I've said for years, and I'll show you where it appears in the writings of one of the Hasidic greats. We all know the Mishnah of Ben Zoma, who tells us who is the wise man, Ezeu Chacham. Most people think the wise man is the one who knows a lot. Ben Zoma tells us who is the Chacham. And you think of Chacham Ovadja, Rav Ovad, you think of Halomed Mikol Adam. A real Chacham is a person who learns from everyone and remembers what everybody said. That's a real Chacham. Otherwise, you're a Chacham. A Chacham is someone who learns from others. And if we look at the next page, I think this is page 6, you see how important this is within the Torah world. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah it gives us a drasha on the Pasuk in Tehillim, which compares someone learning Torah to an eitz shatul al palgei mayim. A sapling nursing from pools of water. The Gemara explains, why does it say nursing and not planted? Shatul and not natua. The Gemara tells us, Kol halomed Torah meirav echad eino roeh siman bracha leolam. If you only learn from one person, you never truly flower. That clock is right, it's 37, right? Make sure I'm on the nose. Right, 37? It's 36. People are very angry at you now. You're telling the rabbi. Don't need another minute. Okay. In any case, it says if you only learn from one rabbi, you never flower yourself. Yirmiyahu has a pasuk that seems to go even further. The Gemara in Brachot tells us. Forget learning from different rabbis. If you sit with peers and you don't learn from each other, Cherev al sonehem shel talmidei chachamim sheyoshvim bad bevad. Talmidei chachamim will sit near each other. Ve'oskim b'Torah, and they don't learn from each other. V'lo od, says the Gemara. What's even worse says shemitapshim. They lose their intelligence when they don't sharpen it by others. And in fact, Jewish tradition goes even further. It's chayim hilam achazikim ba. Many of the Aronot Kodesh have that on it. Torah is compared to an etz chayim. The Gemara in Tani tells us why. Because just like wood, the twigs are what ignite the large pieces of wood. So too the smaller, the Talmidim can teach the most. Third line of the Gemara in Ta'anit, Rabbi Chanina said famously, Harbei la'amadeti mi rabotai. I learned a lot from my Rabbanim. U'mechaverai yoter mi rabotai. And from my friends I learned even more. U'mitalmidai yoter mikulam. And from my students I learned the most. And that's where Jewish tradition has the sense that a Talmid isn't a yes-sayer. A Talmid is a pencil sharpener. The Gemara in Bab Metzia tells us that when Rabbi Yochanan lost his famous Talmid, Reish Lakish, he was miserable. So they brought him a substitute Talmid, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, one of the greatest rabbis of the generation. And Rabbi Yochanan became more desperate. They said, Rabbi Yochanan, what's wrong? He said, this guy brings proofs to everything I say. Reish Lakish, everything I said, he disagreed with me. I miss him. Only Jews. And they had to daven. The rabbis davened for Rabbi Yochanan to be put out of his misery, and that's how he died. He was miserable without his student. And this is how the Rambam explains what we say on the Seder night. ואפילו כולנו חכמים, כולנו נבונים, כולנו זקנים, כולנו יודעים את התורה, מצווה עלינו לספר ביציאת מצרים. And then we quote the story with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was trying to convince the rabbis about saying Kriyat Shema at night, until Ben Zomah came and brought the winning drasha. The Rambam explains, you think you know so much? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the Nasi of his generation, couldn't get his way until Ben Zomah, who didn't even have smicha, which is why he wasn't called rabbi, was the one who taught them. Is it coincidental that the one who taught us Eizeu Chacham Halo Made Mikol Adam was who? Ben Zomah. I'm not a big rabbi, but I know that being a Chacham means learning from different people. The Tosfot Rid, one of the Italian Mishonim, towards the bottom of the page, where Ron says, that's why we paskin like Bet Hillel and not Bet Shammai. The Gemara tells us Bet Shammai was sharper, but Bet Hillel learned what Bet Shammai said too. Rav Kook famously on the bottom of the page, moving on to the next page, applied this beyond the Torah world. The importance to learn from all people. The importance to learn from people who are wrong. On the top of page 7, Rav Kook writes, the greater someone is as a person, the more people he can learn from. Sometimes in our world, we have the last man standing philosophy, which is, if I can tell you why everybody else is no good, this one's no good, this one's no, I'm not saying I'm so good, I happen to be the last one standing with nothing wrong. Rav Kook says the greater person is the person who can learn from everyone. And what's his proof text? Eizeu Chacham Halo Made Mikol Adam. V'lo shiur klal, without exception. Rav Kook in the next piece on page 7 bemoans the fact that we're always divided into camps. 2 camps, he says, the religious and the non-religious. Think how far the Jewish world has come since Rav Kook died. We have so many more camps. And Rav Kook writes, this is a vicious thing because it keeps us from learning from each other. It keeps us from seeing ourselves as one people. It's not that there aren't people who make mistakes, but traditionally we call it a tzaddik, a rasha, a benoni. But when we start talking about it, that's them. Someone tells you should know these Jews. No, that's them. I don't have to learn from them. Rav Kook writes, the last part in bold and underlined, Nitvadea isha lachiv b'shem Yisrael haklali. We should know each other in only one way, Jews. Lo b'shem miflagti u'machanati, not with these divisions. Neida sheyesh lanu b'chol machaneh harbe ma letaken v'harbe ma lekabel me'haor v'hatov ze mizeh. And to know we have a lot to learn from each other and to make ourselves better by doing so. And I think the model for this learning comes from no less than the Malachei Asharet. What do I mean? When we say Kedusha, whether it's Sfarad, Ashkenaz, Ari, we say Kadosh Kadosh, we imitate the angels, Baruch Kvod, but we start off talking about how the angels are Vikara, Zeh El Zeh V'Yamar. Why do we care how they call to each other? The Targum explains these words, Umikablin Dein Min Dein. They receive from one another. V'chulam mikablim alehem, ol malchut shamayim, Zeh Mizeh. And that's what we add the third time when we say Kedusha in the morning. First, in Birkot Kriyat Shema, we talk about how the angels do it, which is why you don't have to stand up, and you don't have to jump up and down, and you don't need a minyan. But then, in Shmona Esrei, in the Tfilat Tibur, we do what the angels do. We imitate the angels, and then you need a minyan. And then we get to Uvadat Tzion Goel, which comes when we're mitargem v'kara zel zeh v'amar with umekablin dein min dein. We love things we appreciate. We love things that we feel make our lives richer and better. We can't love each other if we don't see the value in each other and how each other makes our lives better. If we want to truly love other Jews and other people, we have to look for the aspect of these other people that enriches our own lives. If you look at the bottom of page 7, Rav Nachman Mibreslev writes, "V'gam tzarich kol adam ledaber im chavero b'yirat shamayim." We have to speak to each other with the fear of heaven because we're speaking to God's creations. So we can be inspired from the point our friend has more than we have. We know what it means now that we've read. And then he says, this is the point in our friends. And it's in that point where shorah ahava, where love lies. Love lies in appreciation. And this is part of a much broader theme, this week's parasha, of the ability to see the good. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai on the next page challenged his Talmidim to find the key to the straight path that people should adhere to. And Rabbi Eliezer answered, Ayin Tovah, the good eye. Later on in Pirkei Avot, we're told that this is the first of three features that distinguishes between the Talmidim of Avraham Avinu and the Talmidim of Bilam HaRasha. The Ayin Tova. And the source, I believe, is in Tehillim Perek Lamed Daled. We all know the Psukim. Mi ha'ish hachafetz chayim, ohev yamim lirot tov, nitzor leshonecha meira u'sefatecha midaber mirma. You ask the average person what these Psukim are about, he'll tell you the Isur of Lashon Hara. Well, first of all, it's not about Isurim because it's in Sefer Tehillim. And second of all, if you look carefully, it's not about Lashon Hara. It's about desiring life. What is the good life? Mi ha'ish hachafetz chayim. The answer given is Ohev Yamim, where you love every day. Could you imagine a life where you loved every day? What's the secret to that? Lirot Tov. When you wake up in the morning, if you notice immediately the good in your siblings, the good in your parents, the good in your community, your shul, your school, your workplace, what kind of day would you describe that as? We might call that naive. But you'll love the day. But if you spend your day focused on the negative, you'll hate the day. The advice of Sefer Tehillim is Nitzor l'shoncha meira u'svatecha midaber mirma. It doesn't say Lashon Hara is bad because it's asur. It says it's bad because it infects you with negativity. It keeps you from enjoying your own life. We don't have enough time to go through everything, but I want to highlight three things. First of all, a story about the Rebbe Milubavitch. He had a chassid in Yerushalayim who wrote him the following letter. He said, Rabbi, I'm married, 10 children in Yerushalayim. I'm so busy trying to support my family, it's miserable, help me. The Rebbe wrote him back, Dear so-and-so, Mazal Tov, I'm so happy to hear that you're married. How lucky you are, you have 10 children. The Rebbe had none. And what great zchut you have of living in Yerushalayim. Signed, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And then he wrote, P.S. The fact that you don't appreciate or show appreciation for the good God has given you is keeping him from giving you more. Let's read a poem on the bottom of page 8 that goes on to page 9, written by a high school student from Brooklyn. Today was the absolute day ever. And don't try to convince me that there's something good in every day, because when you take a closer look, the world is a pretty evil place. Even if some goodness does shine through once in a while, satisfaction and happiness don't last. And it's not true that it's all in the mind and heart, because true happiness can be attained only if one's surroundings are good. It's not true that good exists. I'm sure that you can agree that the reality creates my attitude. It's all beyond my control, and you'll never in a million years hear me say today was a very good day. Sound like our children sometimes? Now let's read the poem from the bottom up. Today was a very good day. And you'll never in a million years hear me say it's all beyond my control. My attitude creates the reality. I'm sure you can agree that it's not true that good exists only if one's surroundings are good. True happiness can be attained because it's all in the mind and heart. And it's not true that satisfaction and happiness don't last. Some goodness does shine through once in a while, even if the world is a pretty evil place. Because when you take a closer look, there's something good in every day. And don't try to convince me that today was the absolute worst day ever. What we see in life depends upon what we're looking for in life. On the bottom of page 9, there's a tefillah that many have the custom of saying in Korbanot, which really summarizes everything, and then I'll make one last point. It says, save us from the jealousy towards each other. Tatzilenu mikinat ish mere'ehu. Adarabba, the reverse. Tein b'libenu shenireh kol echad ma'alat chavereinu v'lo chesronam. Give us the ability to see the good in each other and not what we're lacking. And the tefillah continues and says, Chazek et kashrutenu b'yahava elecha, and strengthen our bond of love to you, God, which, as mentioned before, is only possible when we love each other. So what can I tell you practically? Give to each other to create friendship. Look for the good in each other to appreciate and love. And on page 10, using the words of Ahavat, Havei mikabel et kol ha'adam besever panim yafot. How we greet each other reflects on each other and impacts our relationship with each other. In Perek Gimel, it goes even further. Havei mikabel et kol ha'adam besimcha. Not just with a good face, but with happiness. Havei makdim b'shlom kol ha'adam. Be the first to say hello to others. The Gemara tells us how the greatest rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, there was no one who ever said hello to him before he said hello to them, even a random non-Jew in the marketplace. A person who had every reason to see himself on the pedestal used his greatness like Aaron HaKohen to bring people together. Or as we say in Mishlei, Kamayim hapanim lapanim, kain lev ha'adam la'adam. Rashi says, just like water reflects faces, our faces reflect our hearts to each other. Or as Rav Nachman says on the last line of page 10, Efshar lavo lebchinat shalom, ela al yedei ha'arat panim. Peace and love comes from the Ya'er Hashem Panav Elecha, the way we look at each other. We need to transcend the barriers and the defense mechanisms we have in place to make ourselves feel better than other people, and genuinely look for what each person has to teach us, what each person brings to the table, what there is to love in everyone. And when we can do that, God will see what there is to love in us. May this be the last year.